It pleased God in his inscrutable designs to defer revealing to the world the sanctity and glory of Saint Philomena for nearly 15 centuries after her death, during which long period her sacred remains lay unknown and buried in the catacombs. On the 24th May 1802, a remarkable tombstone was discovered in the catacomb of St. Priscilla under the Via Salaria Nova, bearing an inscription Elvina Pax T CVM Phi with the tokens of _martyrdom, viz. A palm, 2 anchors, 3 arrows, an instrument resembling a javelin and a flower generally taken to be a lily, on the emblem of innocence and virginity. The inscription, painted on 3 terracotta slabs, would seem to have been misplaced at the time of burial, either because the person who closed the tomb could not spell, or was in such haste owing to the persecutions of the time that he inadvertently transposed the slabs. Placed correctly, the inscription would read Pax Techiem Philomena Peace to Philomena. On scientific examination, it was found that the head of the saint was much fractured, but the chief bones were entire. On account of their small size and proportions, and especially the small circumference of the head, it was obvious that she must have been martyred in her tender youth, about 12 or 13 years of age, scarcely more. The renowned exponent of the science of Christian archaeology, Commendatore de Rossi, holds, as the result of his researches, that the most recent date of the above celebrated inscription, painted in vermilion upon tiles, does not descend to an epoch later than the reign of Marcus Aurelius or of Commodus, that is, the latter half of the 2nd century. Besides the actual relic of the saint, there was found embedded in cement a small glass vase half broken, the sides of which were covered with dried blood, a still more certain indication of martyrdom. When the black and dried remains of the blood were introduced into a crystal vase, a portion of it was changed into a substance of the finest gold, portion into rubies, emeralds, diamonds, and other colored precious stones, the colors of which were most brilliant. This prodigy, says the writer of the history of St. Philomena, edited by Charles Henry Bowden, a priest of the Oratory in 1894, is permanent, but the particles do not always present the same appearance. Being sometimes more, sometimes less bright, at one time they seem to be mostly rubies, and at another mostly emeralds, and sometimes but rarely mixed with fine ashes. In 1847, Cardinal Deschamps, Archbishop of Malines, who was then a Redemptorist father, made a pilgrimage to Mugnano, where the sacred remains of the saint are deposited, as will be related later on, and he describes this miracle as follows. Need I tell you with what happiness I saw? The arrows, the rods, the anchor, the palm. But above all, the phial of blood, that precious blood shed for love of virginity, and for the virginity of love it was dull and hardened, and behold, Jesus Christ, by communicating to it a ray of the glory of the soul which offered it to him, renders it dazzling as the rainbow. It is a thing marvelous to see. I had read of it in descriptions, but now I have seen it with my own eyes. Later in our own times, a priest, the author of the book St. Philomena, the Wonder Worker, published in Lisbon in 1927, states as follows. The blood is preserved in a small crystal vase which allows the visitor to see it as perfectly as though it lay on the palm of one's hand. I had the happiness of examining this priceless treasure as many as 30 or 40 times. Each time without fail I saw the blood change most marvelously, and the transformation was so clear and distinct as not to allow room for the smallest doubt or misconception. At times small black particles appear which are supposed to presage some cross or affliction or foretell impending evils. At other times the blood changes into the semblance of black earth, seeming to denote the unworthiness of those who visit or venerate it. One very notable case was that of an unworthy priest who knelt to kiss the reliquary containing it when it became very dark, but recovered its brilliancy as soon as he left the church. Shortly after, he suddenly fell dead as he was sitting at a banquet. It is stated that children looking into the vase containing the blood have seen beautiful flowers. An apostolic missionary deposed that when he looked at the blood he distinctly saw the images of the Sacred Hearts of Jesus and Mary. These extraordinary transformations, observes the author of the book, published in Lisbon, are witnessed daily by the crowds who flock to the sanctuary and have been verified and declared authentic by the highest ecclesiastical authorities. The translation of the precious relics of St. Philomena to the place where they are now deposited is a landmark in the history of the saint, pointing as a focusing center to the radiating splendors of this virgin martyr in all parts of the world, with the wonderful growth of devotion to her. We have therefore thought it necessary to devote a separate chapter for the purpose, both on account of the importance of the event and the glowing marvels which attended it. Francesco di Lucia, a holy priest of Mugnano del Cardinale in Naples, had long cherished the desire to possess in his private chapel the body of a saint out of the catacombs. Being given an opportunity to go to Rome in 1805 with the bishop-elect of Potenza, he obtained permission to visit the treasury of sacred relics, the guardian of which gave him the choice to select whichever relic he pleased. While he stood before the relics of Saint Philomena, his soul, which had been in desolation, was inundated with spiritual joy, and he selected it. But a few days after, the permission granted was withdrawn, and he was given the body of another saint. During his stay in Rome, Don Francesco fell seriously ill and lost his sleep, his appetite, and his health. One evening, he promised that if he slept that night, he would choose Saint Philomena for his patron and take her with him to Mugnano if he could get possession of her relics. Instantly, his fever left him. He slept peacefully and rose in the morning in perfect health. Shortly after, the insuperable difficulties met with in obtaining the relics of Saint Philomena were removed, and Don Francesco became the happy possessor of the ashes, the bone and the blood of the saint. Recognizing this to be a miracle, the bishop and the priest promised to carry the bones of Saint Philomena to Naples with due honor. They set out to Naples on the 1st July 1805, but the case containing the relics was forgetfully placed under the seat in the carriage whereon the bishop was to sit. Scarcely had the bishop taken his place in the carriage when he felt sharp blows on his legs. He got out and ordered the box to be fastened more securely. The case was found to be as secure as it possibly could be. On the bishop resuming his seat, the blows became violent and he was forced to leave the carriage. On examining again, it was seen that the case was so fastened that not even a violent jolting of the carriage could move it. On taking his seat for the third time, the bishop was smitten sharply on the legs and severely hurt. It was then that the bishop remembered the promise he had made, and with uncovered bead and tears in his eyes, he kissed the case of relics, which was then placed on the front of the carriage, and recited psalms and hymns and other prayers in the saint's honor. When they arrived at Naples on the 2nd July 1805, the case was opened, and the bones were disposed within a small figure of papier-mâché and enclosed in a case of ebony. The lady who dressed the figure, Donna Angela Terras, the wife of a rich bookseller, was subject to an incurable malady for 12 years, which the saint healed in reward for her services. Many extraordinary changes were observed in the countenance of the figure during the dressing, and strong, sweet perfumes issued constantly from the bones. During the time the relics were in the bookseller's house, miraculous cures were effected. On the 9th August, the case containing the relics was carried from Naples, and one of the bearers, who was suffering from severe internal pains, was relieved of them the instant he put his shoulder to the pole on which the case was slung and restored to perfect health. He also felt the saint as light as a feather, and was actually running with the case when Don Francesco had to stop him. The night time was fixed for the journey to avoid the heat of the sun, and as the moon was full, no lanterns were provided. Heavy and threatening clouds, however, arose which enveloped them in darkness, and a deluge of rain seemed imminent when they could no longer see their way. They implored the saint's help when a column of light penetrated through the clouds and rested on the case of relics, which traveled with them until the dawn while all was blackness around. At about midnight, as they were passing through the village of Semitel near Nola, a place bathed in the blood of martyrs, including the glorious Saint Januarius, Bishop of Benevento, the bearers found the case becoming heavy and impossible to carry further when they had to place it on the ground, on touching which it gave forth a sound as though it had been of bronze. It seemed as if the saint wished to stay a while at the place where so many had shed their blood for the faith like herself. With the help of additional bearers, the case was with difficulty lifted up and transported, when as they receded from Semitel, the burden gradually grew more and more easy until about 2 miles from that place they found it again, as light as before. Such were the miracles witnessed during the journey. The inhabitants of Mugnano were very much in need of rain, and on the eve of the arrival of the saint, while decorating the roads, they said, "If this new saint wishes to make herself known, let her give us the rain we sorely need in the scorching drought from which we have suffered for so many months." It was noonday, when the bells of all the churches were ringing, and no sooner had the sound of the bells ceased than rain came down in torrents and fell plentifully in the territory of Mugnano. Long live the saint, while Don Francesco intoned the litanies with a loud voice. As owing to the pressing throng of people, it was impossible to uncover the case in the church. It was taken into the house of a gentleman. A few from the procession of the clergy, who had awaited the saint being admitted into the courtyard of the house, and in their presence the case was uncovered. The sight of the holy body thrilled all hearts with heavenly joy, and it pleased God to exhibit his power on the occasion by causing the face of the figure enclosing the relics to become so beautiful that it ravished all beholders, many of whom wept with joy, while others exclaimed in a transport of wonder, "O paradise! O paradise! O the wonderful counsels of God!" This was on the 10th of August. This apparently aroused the fury of the powers of darkness, who perhaps foresaw the halo of glory which was to surround this hitherto unknown virgin martyr, and the innumerable graces God would grant the faithful through the new thaumaturga. The sky, which was serene, was suddenly darkened, and the air, which was calm, was filled with clouds of black dust, and a terrific roaring whirlwind threatened destruction all around. The panic-stricken crowds invoked the saint's help, and the furious wind, which approached the relics, seemed to be driven back and rose high into the air with louder noise than it had blown, and calm was restored. God evidently manifested by this prodigy the glory with which the saint, who remained unknown for 1500 years, was invested, and the power she was to wield in future. The procession of the clergy was then set in motion, with the confraternities and their banners, the Neapolitan musicians marching in front. The roads were strewn with flowers and the houses decked with hangings, while the occasional firing of guns and bombs and the sonorous vibrations from the church bells of the city rendered the marvelous scene a splendid and majestic triumph of our holy religion, finer far than any display of earthly pomp. A perfect sea of people either walked by the side of the saint or followed her. The procession lasted 2 hours, and during its course the same unearthly wind arose several times, threatening the destruction of everything around. But the people now no longer feared the raging elements which, notwithstanding their fury, had not the power, another marvel of this marvelous saint, to extinguish even a single candle of the 6 that burned before the saint. When the procession was over and entered the church, this wind passed to the mountains, where it raged for 2 whole days, uprooting trees, although the atmosphere all round was perfectly tranquil. The body of the saint was deposited in the church of Santa Maria della Grazie under a splendid canopy at the gospel corner of the high altar, and solemn High Massachusetts was sung. This was on Saturday, the 10th of August, 1805, a memorable day in the history of Saint Philomena, from which dates the prodigies the world has witnessed. In the words of the author of the History of Saint Philomena, edited by Father Bowden, those who transported the remains of Saint Philomena to the city of Rome little guessed that they were bearing the relics of one of the most glorious thaumaturgas of the Church. Henceforward upon the unknown virgin martyr, God will draw down such a concert of praise as the world has seldom heard. Henceforward her tomb will shine with incomparable splendor. Societies, works of charity, confraternities, archconfraternities, even religious orders will be founded under her patronage, and invocation sanctuaries will be raised in her honor. The faithful of all ages, sexes, and conditions, and of every nation, will implore her intercession, and through her merits and power with God, the very miracles of the Savior himself will be repeated upon the face of the earth. For the blind will see, the dumb will speak, the lame walk, and the dead will be raised to life. In consequence of the numerous miracles, and more especially of the portents worked in the figure of the saint, and in consequence also of the immense concourse of the faithful, Don Francesco unwillingly renounced his intention of keeping the relics in his private chapel and gave them to the church where they had been deposited. Thing was known of Saint Philomena prior to the finding of her relics, and there are no records throwing light on her personal history. What we know of the life of the saint is based entirely on private revelation. The saint revealed to 3 different persons living far apart and utterly unknown to each other the details of her life and martyrdom. These revelations, though of a private character, carry with them no small weight of human probability, one of the 3 to whom they were made being Mother Mary Louisa, Superior General of the Congregation of the Dolours of Mary, who died in the odor of sanctity in the year 1875. The revelation has been frequently published, and the book containing it received the imprimatur of the Holy Office. This does not imply that the Holy See guarantees the authenticity of the revelations, which it rarely does in the case of private revelations, but it shows that we are within our right in accepting it on its own merits, and that the Church finds nothing in it worthy of censure. We will now give an account of the saint's life as based on these revelations. There lived in the 2nd century a pagan king whose name was Callistos, who was the ruler of a small Grecian state. Though blessed with riches and fortune, there was left a void to mar the gladness of the king's home, but, as notwithstanding numerous offerings and vows made by the king, and the queen to the Grecian deities they were not blessed with offspring. A Christian physician of the palace, who was aware of their grief and anguish of mind consequent upon the absence of an heir to the throne and their fortune, spoke to them of the truth of the Christian religion and told them that the one true God whom the Christians adored would, if they embraced it, gladden their home by granting them a child. Enlightened by divine grace after mature deliberation, they received the holy sacrament of baptism. God rewarded their faith by blessing them with a child, the subject of this sketch. The sweet little child, upon whom nature bounty fully lavished its gifts and graces, was called Philomena, or light, as she had been born in the light of faith which her parents received by divine grace, and they gave the name Philomena at baptism. That is, a friend of that light, which illumined her soul by the grace of this sacrament, interpreted by many as daughter of light and signifying in Greek beloved. Endued with grace, the child received her first communion in her 5th year, and consecrated her virginity to God by a vow of perpetual chastity when she was only 11 years of age. The emperor of Rome at the time was the notorious Diocletian, whose name has been handed down to posterity as the inhuman tyrant under whose orders Christians were subject to revolting cruelties and mercilessly put to death. When Philomena was in her 13th year, Galerius, the wicked son-in-law of Diocletian, under orders of the emperor, threatened an aggressive war against her father Wbro. Being terrified, went at once to Rome accompanied by the queen and the princess to crave the protection of the emperor. Diocletian, who was struck by the charming beauty of the modest maid Philomena, promised that he would extend his protection and even place the forces of his empire at the disposal of Callisto's if he would give the hand of his fair daughter to him in marriage. But neither worldly allurements nor even the amelioration of the estate of her beloved parents, who were threatened with a war and the seizure of their possessions, could induce this angelic child to accept the offer. The parents tried every means of persuasion and beseeched her with tears to agree to the royal alliance which would raise her to the exalted dignity of empress. But their endeavors were in vain. Philomena was then taken to the emperor, who tried his utmost to win her hand, but nothing could shake her constancy, and she fearlessly avowed that, as she was already espoused to her divine lord, the King of Kings, to whom she had consecrated her virginity, no alliance with any earthly monarch or other individual was possible. Persuasion, promises and requests having proved futile, the emperor had recourse to measures of threat and severity. She was shut up in a dark, fearful dungeon beneath the imperial palace, bound hand and foot and loaded with chains, given only bread and water for sustenance, and no one was allowed to visit her. The next day Diocletian entered the dungeon and entreated her to accept his proposal. She spurned the offer with contempt. The villainous wretch then made bold to use violence on the helpless child, but Jesus, the lover of chaste souls, instantly came to her rescue. When she saw the danger to which she was exposed, she cried for help, saying, "Jesus, help." No sooner had she uttered these words than the cruel tyrant felt his hands burning as if red-hot iron was placed in them when he attempted to lay hands on her. Unable to endure the agonizing pain, he frantically left the prison, avowing that this was due to witchcraft, and ordered the child to be kept in prison for 40 days bound with heavy chains. Here he visited her daily, endeavoring to gain her consent, and not permitting her anything but bread and water during the 40 days. On the 37th day, the Queen of Heaven appeared to Philomena with a dazzling light, holding the divine infant in her arms. "My child," she said, "you will remain 3 more days in this dungeon, and then on the 40th day of your imprisonment, you will leave this place of sorrow." On hearing these words of comfort, her heart beat for joy. "When leaving it," continued the Blessed Mother of God, "you will undergo cruel tortures for the love of my son." These new tidings filled Philomena with fear, and she felt, as it were, all the bitter agony of dying. "Courage, beloved daughter," added the Queen of Heaven, "beloved above all others," significant words, "for you bear my name and the name of my son. You are called Philomena, or light. My son, your spouse, is called light, star, sun. And am I not likewise called dawn, star, moon, sun? I will be your support. Now is the hour of human weakness and humiliation, but when the moment of trial arrives, you will receive strength and grace." The Mother of God further promised to send Archangel Gabriel, who was her own protector, while on earth, to help and strengthen her during her approaching martyrdom, which would terminate her sufferings in a few days, and apprised her of the glorious crown which awaited her in heaven. The Blessed Virgin then placed on the arms of Philomena the divine infant, who tenderly embraced her, which filled her heart with inexpressible joy. On the 40th day she was taken out of the prison, tied to a pillar and brutally scourged till her body, which was completely torn and mangled, presented the appearance of one continuous ghastly wound, and she was bleeding from head to foot. In this condition, more dead than alive, she was again thrown into the dungeon. But no sooner was she shut up in the dark prison than was it filled with a heavenly light, and 2 angels ministered to her and poured a celestial balm on her wounds, which restored her to complete health. When the emperor heard of the astounding change wrought in her, and found further persuasion unavailing, his ire was roused all the more, and he ordered that an iron anchor be tied round her neck, and she be cast into the Tiber. But God, to show his power, sent again 2 of his angels, who, to the amazement of the spectator, severed the cord which attached the anchor to her neck, and carried Philomena safe to the bank without a drop of water on her garments. Many who witnessed the prodigy were converted and embraced the true faith. But the heart of the cruel Diocletian, who apparently felt mortified at the imperial mandate having been practically set at naught and his vile attempts frustrated, was hardened all the more, and he was determined to do away with this child of grace by some means or other. Philomena was next ordered to be dragged as a sorceress in the public streets of Rome and subsequently put to death by means of arrows shot by bowmen. The Thracian archers, who were as cruel as they were skillful in the use of the bow, were engaged for the purpose. As the pointed arrows successively pierced the tender body of the little maid, deep wounds were formed from which blood gushed forth. With gaping wounds all over the body, heart-rending to behold, and streaming with blood, she was taken a second time and thrown into the dungeon. The divine spouse of her soul once again miraculously healed her wounds, and to the wonderment of all who beheld her, restored her to her original rosy health. The hard-hearted emperor, notwithstanding these divine prodigies, still remained unmoved and ordered that she be again shot with arrows. But God permitted a greater prodigy to take place to show how the weak ones in the eyes of the world can, with his grace and strength, confound and resist the greatest and the strongest. Notwithstanding every effort made, the arrows could not be made either to leave the archers' bows, or if they did, they fell at the child's feet without the least injury to her body. The relentless persecutor, roused to fury, ordered that the arrows be heated, red hot, by the marksmen and hit with all their might. But marvel of marvels, though they were aimed at the tender virgin and flew with lightning speed, they instantly reversed their course, turned back upon the executioners themselves, 6 of whom were killed on the spot. The rest were wounded and fled for their lives. Many of the eyewitnesses of this miracle were converted thereby and embraced the Christian religion. Diocletian, feeling on the one side his pride wounded and fearing a tumult of the mob on the other, ordered the Virgin Maid to be beheaded. This order was carried out on a Friday, on the 10th of August at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, just at the hour, and on the day our Lord died on the cross. NY sketch, however brief, of the history of Saint Philomena would be incomplete, we should rather say. Imperfect without reference to the miracles, both in the natural and in the supernatural order, attributed to the saint. In fact, the approbation of the devotion to Saint Philomena and the authorization of the public worship of the saint by the Holy See was based more on the miracles wrought through the saint's intercession than on the examination of her life, of which, as already stated, nothing was known except the name and the fact of her martyrdom on the discovery of her tomb. The Pope, who promulgated the decree authorizing the worship of the saint, His Holiness Gregory XVI, who invariably called her the great saint and proclaimed her to be the great wonder-worker of the 19th century, had seen with his own eyes the extraordinary cure worked by the saint on Pauline Jaricot, one of the 2 chief propagators of the devotion in France, the other being the holy Curé of Ars, whence it spread in Europe and the other parts of the world. Pauline Jaricot was a beautiful French girl who, as the favorite daughter of wealthy parents, inherited a vast fortune. Notwithstanding the allurements of the gay and fashionable society which singled her out on account of her striking beauty and the noble gifts of head and heart which she was endowed with, in addition, she felt an interior call for a higher life, to which, after a fierce struggle, she faithfully responded, enlightened by the grace of God, who willed that she should play an important part in the Church. It was she who founded the Association of the Living Rosary and the Society for the Propagation of the Faith, and took a leading part in the working of the Association of the Holy Childhood. It pleased God that she should also be instrumental in spreading devotion to Saint Philomena, not only in France but throughout Christendom. The poor girl was attacked at an early age with a disease which affected her both in mind and body, reducing her to a state of emaciation, which, after a short respite, became chronic. The sufferings which she endured for as many as 10 years, though indescribable, were borne patiently and silently. In March 1834, the disease grew so much worse that concealment was no longer possible. An idea of the gravity of her illness can be gleaned from the description she has herself given of it. This is what she says. This complaint, the seat of which was in the heart, redoubled in intensity, and occasioned such violent palpitations that they could be heard from afar, and even raised the ribs. Sometimes any movement or change of position caused such a rush of blood to the heart that I was threatened with suffocation. The pulse and respiration then became imperceptible, and the most severe measures were alone able to restore a little animation and to recall warmth into my icy limbs. I was, therefore, condemned to lie completely motionless, for I could not move without exposing myself to the imminent danger of breaking the strained blood vessels. The violence and rapidity of the pulsations caused a displacement of the ribs, while the extraordinary dilation of the heart impeded the action of the lungs and rendered breathing a positive torture. To me, the violent action of the heart had caused an interior wound of such a nature that the nourish meant I took might have penetrated to it, hence I had to take the utmost precaution to avoid being suffocated. The physician, moreover, had established 2 large exterior wounds in order to diminish the progress of the evil. Various other sufferings, still more complicated, had reduced me to a state that showed every symptom of a speedy approaching dissolution. Such was her condition during the year 1834, with the exception of intervals of respite obtained by prayers, when she was finally warned by the doctors not even to receive visitors, as she would thereby shorten her life, which might cease at the moment she least expected it. Hearing the miracles wrought by means of the relics of Street Philomena, whose name was on every lip, and having herself experienced the efficacy of a novena performed in honor of the saint, she conceived the desire to kneel at the shrine of the illustrious Virgin, and to go at least as far as Paray. Lemonial, her object being not to seek a cure, but to settle the affairs of her soul. Notwithstanding the opposition of the doctor who was consulted and expecting dissuasion from others, she set out secretly one evening, lying at full length in an easy post-chaise, her whole frame having become swollen, accompanied by her chaplain, a lady friend, and a servant. She reached Paray Lemonial more dead than alive, and settled the affairs she had so much at heart. She then decided to go to Rome and get the Pope's blessing. Traveling by coach in those days over the Alps through wild and deserted country was extremely wearisome and full of perils, and Pauline's sufferings increased to such an extent that, when they reached Chambry, her life was despaired of, and she resigned herself to die. She remained unconscious for 2 days, and after a novena made to Saint Philomena by the pupils of the convent in the town, she felt able to resume the journey. When they reached the top of Mount Cenis, a beautiful child appeared at the side of the carriage, and with a smile laid on the couch of the suffering invalid a fragrant white rose and disappeared. This delicate attention of Providence, as Pauline called it, consoled and encouraged everyone. When they reached Loreto, Pauline had another serious relapse, but after a few days' rest she rallied. The attacks during the last stage of her journey to Rome being very frequent, she reached the Eternal City in an almost unconscious state and was received by the nuns of the Convent of the Sacred Heart at the Trinita dei Monti. When the Holy Father heard of her arrival in Rome, and that she was utterly incapable of going through a presentation at the Vatican in her weak state, he decided to visit her himself, a distinguished honor to console and thank his dear daughter for the benefits which the Church owed to her, and give her his blessing. Struck by the sad condition of the invalid, the Pope asked her to pray for him as soon as she got to heaven. "Yes, Holy Father, I promise to do so," answered Pauline. "But if, when I return from Mugnano, I come on foot to the Vatican, will your Holiness deign to proceed without delay to the definitive examination of the cause of Saint Philomena?" "Yes, yes, my child," replied Gregory XVI, "for that would be a miracle of the first class." Then turning towards the superioress of the convent, he added in Italian, so that Pauline might not understand it, "How ill she is, our daughter. She seems to have come forth from the tomb. We shall never see her again. She will return no more." Pauline understood these words and smiled. It was August when the little party left Rome for Mugnano, and the heat was so terrible that they had to rest by day and travel by night. When they arrived at Naples, Pauline was speechless and almost breathless, and they wished to make a halt. But her eyes expressed a desire to proceed, and they finally reached Mugnano on the 8th of August 1835, and arrived at the church just at the opening of the celebration of the solemn festival of Saint Philomena, an unforeseen coincidence which filled her with joy. When the people of Mugnano saw Pauline carried in a chair to the shrine, they were filled with compassion. "Dear Saint Philomena," they exclaimed, "it is absolutely necessary for thee to cure this holy French woman, who has come from so far to pray to thee. She has rendered great enough services to God and His Holy Mother for thee to grant her all we ask." In their vehemence they knocked at the urn of the saint and said, "Dost thou hear us, Philomena? If thou dost not cure her at once, we will pray to thee no more." 2 days after, on the morning of the feast of Saint Philomena, August 10th, when the invalid received Holy Communion near the urn of the saint, she experienced such terrible pains all over the body, and her heart beat so violently that she fainted away. The crowd, thinking that she was dead, gave voice to such violent outcries that it was thought best to carry the dying sufferer out of the church. But regaining conscience, she expressed a wish to remain even if she had to breathe her last, and was contemplating the Virgin Martyr with her gaze fixed upon the urn. Then she suddenly burst into a flood of tears. A tinge of color came back to her pallid cheeks, her icy members regained the warmth of life, and a heavenly joy filled her desolated soul that she believed she was about to enter paradise. But it was not death, it was life. She was cured by Saint Philomena in answer to the prayers of so many of the saint's clients. Pauline remained in Mugnano for some time, her soul filled with joy to overflowing, and greatly loved by the people. When at last she had to tear herself away from the sanctuary, she took a great relic of Saint Philomena with her, which she enclosed in a beautiful life-size statue of the saint, which, clothed as it was in royal garments, was hailed by all as the Princess of Paradise. When Pauline arrived at Naples, she was received with great honor by the bishop, who, in the presence of the Apostolic Nuncio and the King of Sicily, present ed her with the blood of Saint Januarius to kiss and 3 venerate. She soon reached Rome, and in the full enjoyment of health and strength she was this time presented at the Vatican. Looking at her, Gregor XV exclaimed, "Is this indeed my dear child? Does she arise from the tomb, or has God manifested in her favor the power of the Virgin Martyr?" "It is I indeed, Holy Father." She replied, "It is that poor Pauline Marie from Lyons, whom your Holiness saw at the point of death 2 months ago, and whom Saint Philomena has regarded with compassion. As she has restored me to life, deign to grant me permission to fulfill the vow which I have made to build a chapel in honor of my benefactress, certainly my child." Answered the Pope, "And I shall proceed without delay to the definitive examination of a cause dear to all Catholic hearts." He then heard from her own lips all the circumstances connected with her visit to Mugnano and the details of her cure. He desired her to remain a whole year in Rome, in order that the miracle might be thoroughly investigated. At the end of the year, Pauline, with the blessing of the Holy Father, returned to her native place, where she built a beautiful chapel to Saint Philomena, who signified her marked affection to Pauline by the numerous miracles for which the new sanctuary became noted, the walls, and even the roofs thereof being covered with the offerings of the rich and the poor. It was in this sanctuary at Fourvières that the celebrated cure of Mademoiselle Leclerc, who had lost the use of both her legs 8 years before, was worked. We wish we could continue this narrative and recount the good works of Pauline Jaricot, who, after her miraculous cure, lived for 27 years and died full of merits and suffering and abandonment, a martyr for the conversion of the people. But for want of space, we reluctantly take leave of our dear noble heroine. Another instrument whom God made use of for spreading the devotion to Saint Philomena was the holy Curé of Ars, Jean-Marie Baptiste Vianney, who has since been raised to the altars. A holy friendship existed between Pauline Jaricot and the saintly Curé. Pauline spoke to him of Saint Philomena and gave him a portion of the relics she had obtained from Mugnano, uttering these prophetic words, "Have full confidence in this great saint. She will obtain for you all that you ask." The holy Curé erected a chapel in the church at Ars in honor of Saint Philomena, where he placed the relics, and it soon became the means of obtaining innumerable graces, both spiritual and temporal, the number of miracles being reckoned by thousands. It is said that the holy Curé of Ars owes in part his celebrity in the Catholic world to Saint Philomena, while the Virgin Martyr, on the other hand, owes the rapid universal spread of the devotion to her in France partly to the zeal of the Curé of Ars. She was his favorite saint, his dear little saint, his celestial agent, as he called her. She appeared to him and conversed with him. "My children," he would often say, "Saint Philomena has great power with God, and she has moreover a kind heart. Let us pray to her with confidence. Her virginity and generosity in embracing her heroic martyrdom have rendered her so agreeable to God that he will never refuse her anything that she asks for. U.S. Saint Philomena granted everything in answer to the prayers of the Curé of Ars. He consulted her in all his difficulties and asked her advice in all his undertakings. He did everything for her, and she did everything for him. She seemed to take a delight in bestowing the most wonderful favors on him. Innumerable are the miracles worked and favors obtained through the intercession of the Virgin Martyr by all classes of people, under circumstances of varying nature and in needs of all kinds, all of which are either vouched for by the recipients of the graces or authenticated by the ecclesiastical authorities after being duly examined and verified. We will select a few of these well-attested miracles at random and close this chapter. In 1845, Pasquale, a child of 8 years, was on the point of dying. In their desolation, his parents invoked Saint Philomena. Instantly, the boy opened his eyes and in childish accents said, "Saint Philomena has come with 2 angels, one holding a little basket and the other a palm." Then she came nearer to me, made the sign of the cross over me, and said to me, "Thy health shall be restored to thee." The poor child was saved, and in memory of the favor, the parents erected a magnificent chapel to Saint Philomena in Pescopagno, their home. A young choir religious of the monastery of the Santissima Annunziata at Foggia had been afflicted by one of the most hopeless and terrible of maladies, viz. Mania, for 3 years, and no medical treatment had produced the slightest amelioration. One of her aunts, who was a nun, had recourse to the holy martyr and sent to Mugnano to have prayers offered for her. One day during the divine office, a gentle murmur was heard as of little keys being shaken together, which continued for a long time and which was found to proceed from a picture of Saint Philomena, and it was taken as a sign that the grace was granted. This was indeed the case, for in that moment the nun was restored to reason. Donna Maria Emilia, a professed religious of the monastery of the Croce di Lucca in Naples, daughter of one of the princes Roberdoni of Catania, had in the prime of life been struck down by paralysis and complete blindness, her life, which was a living death, being the object of deep compassion. She lay motionless in her bed on the night of the 21st of April, 1856. "These are her own words I saw," she said, "in a dream, Saint Philomena, who called me by name Miraculous." I answered, "What wilt thou?" The saint replied, "I have come to tell thee that Saturday is the feast of Our Lady of Good Counsel." But I said, "What must I do on the occasion?" Saint Philomena added, "Thine eyes are to be opened, and for such a signal grace thou shalt offer eyes of silver to the Virgin of Good Counsel, which is in the small corridor. Thou shalt say that it is a miracle in the night of the 26th of April, the feast of Our Lady of Good Counsel. I awoke at 6:30, and Saint Philomena came at 7, took me by the arm and said, 'Miraculous, I am Philomena, open thine eyes.' And she squeezed my arm so tightly that it pained the whole day. At the self-same hour I opened my eyes, and so I arose from my bed without assistance on the 28th of the same month. I spoke as well as before my speech was affected. The certificate of the physician who had attended this sister is deposited in the archives of the Archbishops of Naples. Philomena, edited by Charles Henry Bowden, priest of the Oratory, 1894. In September 1888, 2 sick persons were prayed for before the relics of Saint Philomena in Paris for their souls and bodies, both of which were in danger. Only 1 week later, one of them knelt at the altar with his whole family, a thing he had not done for 40 years, and the other received the last sacraments. The present saintly Bishop of Mylapore, the Right Rev. Dom Ribeiro Vieira de Castro, who was devout to Saint Philomena, experienced her prompt and powerful protection. He writes as follows: "I have indeed learned to love Saint Philomena, and am most grateful to her. She has given me many signs of her powerful intercession. On one occasion I was in need of funds for my missionary college, and she obtained for me no less a sum than 20,000 escudos. On another occasion we had to begin important improvements in the college of QQJIs, and these unfortunately threatened to be the cause of serious inconvenience. I promised Saint Philomena that if she helped me and had the improvements concluded at a certain date, I would reopen an oratory which had been closed and dedicated in her honor. She did all I asked her. Saint Philomena is so desirous to grant favors that she not only rewards those who propagate devotion to her, but even chastises those who refuse to make her known. An archdeacon of Ascoli in Italy who refused to expose a relic of the Virgin Martyr presented by a lady who requested him to spread the saint's devotion, and would not give the relic even to the bishop who wished to use it for a solemn feast in honor of the saint, was struck totally blind. He regained his sight only after praying to the saint and taking the relic to bless himself with it. The most fatal punishments fall upon those who deride the saint's miracles and pride themselves in not believing things which appear to them contrary to the law of nature. Many of these have been struck down by unknown and incurable disease. Many have gone out of their minds and perished, and numbers have fallen down dead in the very moment in which they were deriding the wonders worked through the saint. In one of the great cities, the first feast of Saint Philomena was being celebrated with much splendor, when a certain ecclesiastic said contemptuously, "Did we want another saint here? Have we not feasts enough?" And murmuring went home. While the bystanders were talking of what he had uttered, they beheld his servants running out of his house in search of doctors, as he was taken suddenly ill and lay as if dead. He shortly after expired. The author of the book Saint Philomena, the Wonder Worker, published at Lisbon already referred to, mentions what he calls the special sign which the clients of Saint Philomena visiting her sanctuary at Mugnano receive from time to time. This priest had himself visited it in 1909. On the 9th day of his visit, while he was in a side chapel, one of the sisters of the sanctuary approached him and said, "Father, have you seen the sign?" "What sign?" asked the priest. "Oh," she said, "you haven't got the sign I have." "Seen so many wonders during the days I have been here," replied the priest. "If it is anything more wonderful, I would not dare to ask for it. It would be presumption on my part." "Oh no, no," answered the sister. "You have come from a long distance, and have remained here so many days. The little saint must give you the sign." Saying this, she took him towards the altar, where the urn containing the miraculous image is placed. They knelt in front of the urn and began a short prayer, when suddenly a sharp report rang out, as if the crystal glass had been struck by something hard. The report was so distinct and sharp that the Reverend Mother, who was higher up in the church, ignorant of what bad transpired, asked, "Whom is it for?" "It is for the Father," replied the sister. The priest was then informed that the knock is a well-known sign given from time to time to clients of the saint, and was looked upon as a special mark of her good pleasure. A similar occurrence is recorded of the Pontiff, Pius IX of revered memory, who was a most fervent client of Saint Philomena and a zealous promoter of devotion to her, and who, when he was Archbishop of Imola, fell seriously ill, his life being despaired of, and lay about to close his eyes forever to this world. The knockings often given by the saint when she was going to grant some grace were heard by his bedside upon a table, upon which there stood a beautiful urn containing an effigy of Saint Philomena, for an account of the favors obtained through the intercession of Saint Philomena after the erection of the oratory of the saint at Mysore, which bids fair to become the central shrine of the saint in India. The reader is referred to the following chapter. Chapter 5. Erection of an oratory of the saint at Mysore. Client of Saint Philomena in Mysore, one of whose daughters was named Philomena at baptism, entertaining an ardent desire to promote the devotion to the saint with a view to the saint's special patronage being secured for this favorite child of his, had, with the approval of the ecclesiastical authorities, undertaken to construct a shrine of the saint in St. Joseph's Church at Mysore. A neat little oratory was accordingly built in the compound of the church, and the statue of the saint erected on Monday, the 10th October 1927. The imposing ceremony of blessing the statue was performed by His Lordship the Right Reverend M. Dispachersy, the Bishop of Mysore, who immediately thereafter celebrated a Mass at the oratory. At the request of the said client of Saint Philomena, His Excellency the Most Reverend Peter Pisani, a former delegate apostolic of India, sent a reliquary containing the bone of the Virgin Martyr with a certificate of its genuineness. The reliquary, enclosed in a beautifully carved sandalwood case, was exposed for public veneration after the close of the bishop's mass, when a priest of the neighboring diocese delivered a sermon on the life and glories of Saint Philomena. The relic, which was exposed in the oratory throughout the day, attracted throngs of worshippers who eagerly kissed it, till nightfall, when the day's proceedings were brought to a close by the benediction of the Blessed Sacrament. The saint, as if to mark her approbation and evince her satisfaction of the erection of the oratory in her honor, was pleased to grant within a few days a singular favor. In the same month, October 1927, the assistant priest of St. Joseph's Church in Mysore was laid up with enteric fever. The illness having assumed a serious aspect, he had to be removed to St. Martha's Hospital at Bangalore. In spite of best medical aid, the fever showed no sign of abatement. To make matters worse, what is known as malignant malaria superimposed the enteric, and for some days the poor priest was hovering between life and death. On receipt of the disconcerting news, the Sisters of the Good Shepherd Convent at Mysore, reposing entire confidence in God, invoked the aid of our powerful advocate St. Philomena. They obtained from the parish priest of St. Joseph's Church the relic of the saint received from Rome for public veneration, and had a novena performed in honor of the saint, the prayers being recited by the orphans maintained in the convent, in the presence of the relic before a small statue of the saint placed behind it. The novena was commenced on the 26th October, and intimation was received on the 27th of the illness having suddenly taken a turn for the better. In fact, the change in the condition of the priest took place on the very day the novena was started. Soon after, the patient was declared to be out of danger, and he has now regained his former health. Praise and glory to St. Philomena, who was pleased to cast her first loving look on one of the pastors of the church in which her devotion has been established. Ever since the erection of her oratory at Mysore, the saint has been pleased to grant numerous favors to the faithful who have invoked her intercession, and innumerable petitions and offerings are being received for being prayed for or deposited at the shrine. Each day's post brings the parish priest in charge of St. Joseph's Church a number of letters, including petitions and thanksgivings, and the number of such letters received at the time of publication of this booklet is on an average 30 per day. These are received from various parts of India, Ceylon, Burma, and the Federated Malay States. It will not be possible within the space at our disposal to detail the favors obtained, which would fill pages. We will content ourselves with selecting a few, mostly from the letters received by the parish priest of St. Joseph's Church, Mysore. In Shimoga, a child whose life was despaired of was expected to die every moment, and as a last resort, the sorrow-stricken parents prayed to St. Philomena and applied a picture of the saint touched to her relic. To their surprise, that very moment there was a perceptible change of condition for the better, indicating signs of recovery, and the child was completely restored to health. In March 1928, a Hindu of Mangalore, who was grieved beyond measure at not having been blessed with children, devoutly petitioned to St. Philomena to satisfy his one great desire in this world. His request was granted, and with unbounded joy he asked the editor of the Canaris Messenger of the Sacred Heart to publish his thanksgiving for having so speedily obtained the favor. Henry Jacob, a Protestant, aged 30 years, who was employed in one of the coffee estates of Courgois, suffering from dropsy. On the 8th May 1928, he made a pilgrimage to St. Antony's shrine at Doranhalli, a place 20 miles from Mysore, where, on the advice of one of his Catholic friends, he decided to become a Catholic. On his way back from Doranhalli, he passed through Mysore, where his illness took a serious turn. He became highly delirious and was quite unconscious. The priest of the place, who was sent for, baptized the sick man sub conditione, as he had previously manifested a desire to receive baptism, and tied a silk ribbon touched to the relic of St. Philomena around his neck, the priest and the friends of the dying man offering up prayers on his behalf to St. Philomena. After a couple of days, the man completely regained his consciousness when he again asked for baptism. When he was told that the sacrament had been administered to him, he expressed satisfaction. After being instructed in the Christian faith, the last rites of the church were administered to him. He made out his will and died on the 29th May in pious sentiments, entirely resigned to the will of God. The vicar of the Church of Chowgat in South Malabar intimates in his letter dated 25th August 1928 that a Carmelite novice, Sister Mary Rita, who was suffering from severe attacks of fever and headache for a long time, obtained instantaneous relief by applying the picture of St. Philomena touched to the relic at Mysore, and that the fever had just left her. The following account of favors received from Mr. H. J. Muff, Calcutta, by the parish priest of St. Joseph's Church, Mysore, in June 1928, goes to show not only our dear little saint's readiness in granting them, but that when she is invoked with childlike simplicity, she answers our prayers with the same sentiments irrespective of what is asked for is trivial or of grave importance. When my little girl was very ill with high fever, recourse was had to Saint Philomena and her picture touched to the relic applied. The next morning she was playing about as though nothing had happened. For months my wife was suffering from piles.on. Applying the picture she had relief the same day and a temporary cessation from all pain. The wife of Mr. TV, a non-Catholic, received immediate response to her prayer to Saint Philomena, her child having been placed in school by others as desired by her. My wife and myself asked for better food and fruits, and we received the same day a parcel of mangoes and some more the next day from a neighbor of ours. Money was also forthcoming for butter and other dainties. I had recourse to Saint Philomena to obtain refund of my money deducted from my salary for May 1928. On the same day I saw my superior. Not only was the refund sanctioned, but I was also given the hope of an increase of pay besides medicine and free treatment. Miss Du was collecting subscriptions for the church extension fund, met me in the church on the 28th May 1928 and told me that she was not able to collect anything the whole day. I gave her a picture of Saint Philomena and asked her to invoke the saint's help. Within a few minutes, by the time I went to the church and returned, she got a rupee. My wife asked Saint Philomena to obtain for her 10 rupees, promising to send a rupee to the saint's oratory at Mysore. The very next day she received a letter from her sister in Kursong stating that 10 rupees had been remitted to her by money order. We can multiply such instances of ready answer to prayers offered to the saint, but from the few given in this and in the preceding chapter the reader can form an idea of the childlike generosity of our loving and lovable saint. We have seen that within a few days of the erection of her oratory in St. Joseph's Church at Mysore, St. Philomena granted a singular favor to the assistant parish priest of that church. We will now recount a remarkable favor granted to the parish priest himself before closing this chapter. We will let the priest himself relate it, who, in gratitude for the favor received, and for the purpose of revealing the glories of the saint, has reported the fact for publication in all the Catholic newspapers and journals in circulation in India. A marvelous favor granted by Saint Philomena as narrated by the pastor of St. Joseph's Church in Mysore, and South India. In a remarkably short time she would grant wonderful graces, powerfully drawing towards her hundreds of grateful clients from all parts of India, Burma, Ceylon, and the Federated Malay States. A week after the devotion was started, one of the parishioners suggested to me that something might be done to make known far and wide in this part of the world how great and lovable the saint is, and how astounding are her prodigisi. I must aver that I had a certain amount of misgiving as to the feasibility of the proposal, but in no way disconcerted and imposing implicit confidence in the powerful help of the saint, for whose greater glory the task was to be cheerfully undertaken. We began the propagation of her devotion with a hopeful spirit. Our modus operandi was simple enough. The admirable prayer indulgence by His Lordship the Bishop of Mysore, the RT, Rev. Dr. M. Dispatchers D.D., who has himself an abiding love and devotion to the saint, and the likeness of the beautiful statue installed in the oratory were printed and distributed after getting the pictures touched to the relic piece of bone of the saint sent by His Grace Mangiar. Peter Pisani, D.D., Archbishop of Constance and former Delegate Apostolic of the East Indies. This was followed up by the distribution of a very interesting booklet on the life of Saint Philomena. Hardly a month elapsed when I was flooded with petitions intended to be placed under the relic and applications for pictures and silken cords of the saint. The same parishioner, who first put the idea into me, tauntingly observed that before long the dear little saint will compel me to engage a clerk for dealing with the voluminous correspondence. I smiled at his remark, but did not for a moment dream that what was uttered in a jesting manner would come to be too true. The splendid success that attended our first efforts would not, for obvious reasons, dispel the misgivings I had. As a priest, I had to be more wary than a layman not to be carried away by sudden impulses of enthusiasm. Day after day, the number of petitions increased, and I and my assistant Rev. Father David Diosa felt an inward happiness, which I cannot very well describe, in devoting all our spare moments for the work we had undertaken. It was an eye-opener to us to receive amazing accounts of the favors granted, and there arose at this stage in our hearts a sincere compunction for having ever doubted the great power of this Princess of Paradise. The boys' school attached to the church was on the verge of being closed for want of funds. I was at my wits' end as to what I should do, and to whom I should appeal for money. So I joined the army of petitioners and placed my HTFMble petition to Saint Philomena, imploring her to save the institution by obtaining for me a small sum of Rs. 50 by way of offerings. The dear little saint, always said to be playful, answered my prayers the same month. I received thanksgivings amounting to Rs. 50, not a rupee less, not a rupee less, not a rupee more. Why did you not ask the saint for more, Father? You know that she would play with you and take you at your word, was the question that was put to me, but I offered my grateful thanks to the saint, leaving it to her to do just as she pleased in the matter of extending her helping hand to this poor church and the school. Since then, she has signified her generous patronage beyond all my expectations. There was, however, another matter which seriously disturbed my mind and often made me feel despondent. It was the miserable condition of our church, which, to use the proverbial expression, was as poor as the mouse, if any, that lived there. This house of God was built by His Highness the late Maharaja Sri Krishnaraja Wadiyar, I so far back as 1834, and to this day the mural inscription in old Kannada of the royal donor's munificent gift is carefully preserved. Depressed though I was, a refulgent ray of hope, that saint Philomena would come to my succor, made me feel confident that sooner or later she will cast her favorable eye on this church. A few days after, to my unutterable astonishment, Mr. Mirza M. Ismail, CIE, OBE, Dewan of Mysore, expressed of his own accord a keen desire to give the church a prominent frontage by knocking down the crumbling mud wall of the compound and putting up at the cost of government a more artistically designed one. His Highness the Maharaja of Mysore, GCSI GBE, with his usual generous heart and solicitude for the wants of all communities, presented 2 pairs of ornamental iron gates worth Rs. 500. The work, which is estimated to cost Rs. 2,000, is in rapid progress, and in the course of a month or so the church and its surroundings, which were in a neglected condition for years past, for want of funds, will be one of the prettiest spots of the picturesque Mysore, the garden city of India. Is this not an irrefutable evidence to convince the skeptics that the heavenly princess is powerful, and that God, on account of the intense love He bears for her, will not refuse anything she may ask for our spiritual or worldly well-being? Signs are not wanting to indicate that she has chosen the humble shrine in Mysore as the center for the propagation of her devotion in India, and I, on my part, shall to my dying day arouse in those whom I shall come across a fervent Jove for this great virgin martyr and wonder worker. Compass of this booklet, it has been possible only to touch the fringe, as it were, of the marvelous with which everything connected with Saint Philomena is. Redolent, her birth, her short life, her martyrdom, her death, the finding of her remains, their translation, and the spread of her devotion, the object being to place within easy reach of such of her clients as may not have access to larger books or may not afford to buy them, a short account giving the salient points in the history of the saint. The life and glories of this saint were recently reviewed in '67. Philomena's Bell, a monthly magazine published at Hertz in England, from which we give a few extracts. One of the greatest miracles of Saint Philomena, who is so renowned a miracle worker that Mgr. Dumanoir tells us it is part of the praise given her by the Church that she should be known as thaumaturga, or worker of wonders. He is always said to be the marvelous swift diffusion of devotion to her. Throughout the world her sweet name is run like fire in a forest. In incredibly brief space one, wherever devotion to her rises, its results are flowers and fruits of holiness so great that bishops authorizing it in their dioceses have declared that it produces the effects which missions achieve among the faithful. A devoted Dominican priest client of the martyr, writing very recently, makes the following striking statements, based upon a wide experience. The venerable Curé of Ars was raised up by God to serve as the model and patron of priests. They can easily follow his example in ways other than his extreme rigors, which require a special call from God. What can be more easy, for instance, than to imitate his sweet intimacy, his unbounded confidence, his tender devotion to Saint Philomena? If priests would only place a statue of this great thaumaturga in their churches and spread her devotion, their churches would soon become centers of devotion and abundant graces would flow on pastor and people. The sick, the sorrowful, and above all, the most hardened sinners would soon reap the benefit of the saint's powerful intercession. The advent of the saint to a church or district is the signal for the most amazing blessings. The wonders wrought in some of the sanctuaries of Saint Philomena are so marvelous as almost to rival those of Mugnano itself. Would only that priest could be induced to place a statue of the saint in their churches. She herself would do the rest. She is the saint of remarkable cures, not short of miraculous. In innumerable cases, she is the saint of happy marriages. Idyllically happy in some instances, devotion to her often produces religious vocations in souls, showing her as Christ's saint, attracting others to run after his footsteps. She loves to lead and light souls into the church. For is she not the daughter of light? Philomena, the child of prayer, promised to convert royal parents as one of the blessings Christianity should bring them. She is marvelous in financial trouble or difficulty, helping sometimes with large sums given in remarkably unexpected ways, sometimes in the small, wearing needs of many poor days, and in the long pressure of limited means. She is the sweet giver of little pleasures, holidays, changes of air badly needed, pleasant letters and visits, even flowers and sweets for those whose joys are few. She loves and cares for children. She protects and cares in marked manner for priests, for religious and for missionaries. There is no trouble she cannot comfort, no answer she cannot obtain from the hearts of Jesus and Mary. From 67. Philomena's Bell, issued in July 1928, Vol. V. No. 3. Truly may it be said that God is wonderful in his saints. It has pleased Providence from time to time, from the earliest ages of the Church, to raise up for the defense of his holy Church, no less for the edification and encouragement of the members within its fold, saints endowed with remarkable power and sanctity, revealing in them his own greatness and glory. Saint Philomena is one of them, and she may well be said to be a saint of our own times, whose astounding miracles have attracted the notice of even the secular non-Catholic press. If we wish to participate in the graces and favors which this glorious thaumaturga so lavishly bestows on her devoted clients, we must have recourse to her with the sentiments and dispositions with which she expects us to approach her. The resplendent purity of this chaste soul, who vowed her virginity to God in her childhood, her unstinting generosity in responding to the interior voice of her beloved in preference to all earthly offers and considerations, her unbounded confidence in God in the midst of frightful perils to which she was exposed, her unswerving fidelity to the divine spouse of her soul, and her steadfast devotion and adherence to our holy faith for which she shed her blood after enduring the most cruel torments. These are the characteristic traits in her life. These are the virtues of which she sets an example, and in the practice of which she expects her clients to imitate her, each according to his or her own state of life. In the beautiful little prayer to Saint Philomena, which is inserted below, to which the Bishop of Mysore has been pleased to attach an indulgence of 50 days, in invoking her intercession, the saint is asked to obtain for us these virtues. Let us recite the prayer with due dispositions and more with our hearts than our lips, and thus enlist ourselves under the banner of this glorious Virgin Martyr as one of her special and favored clients.